We at Stanford Parkinson's Caregiver Support Program and Brain Support Network are so delighted you all can join us today to hear from veteran journalist Dave Iverson. Dave is the producer of two Parkinson's-related documentaries. Both are terrific. One is called My Father, My Brother, and Me, back in 2009. It's really a history of his family's coping with Parkinson's disease. And then more recently, a wonderful documentary called Capturing Grace, which is a lot about exercise and dancing in particular with Parkinson's disease. He was the host for many years of the Michael J. Fox Foundation educational webinars on Parkinson's. And if you're like me, you might remember Dave from his work with KQED and PBS. Dave is going to be talking about his memoir, which is going to be released in March, just next month. It's titled Winter Stars: An Elderly Mother, an Aging Son, and Life's Final Journey. Dave himself was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2004, and he was actually in the middle of making his first documentary, My Father, My Brother, and Me, when he decided to move in with his 95-year-old mother, Adelaide. And his book is about his 10-year caregiving journey. So Dave, I want to let everybody know that to ask questions, there's both the chat box and the question box, and Denise Dagon is here as well, and she will be sharing she and I will both be monitoring our both the question and the chat box. And so we'll turn it over to Dave for a short period. We've asked him to read some excerpts from his book, and then we'll answer some questions. So thanks so much for joining us, Dave.
Thank you, Robin. It's really a great pleasure to be with all of you today. It's Stanford's always been a big part of my life. I grew up in Menlo Park. My dad was on the faculty at Stanford, and later I had the good fortune to be able to attend Stanford as well. So it's very special to me to be able to be part of a discussion that involves the Stanford Parkinson's support group. So thank you. Before we start, I also wanted to mention that at the end of the program, our discussion today, Robin and I will talk a bit more about how you can get a copy of my memoir if you're interested in doing so in a way that will benefit the Stanford Parkinson's support group. We want to make some copies available and have the proceeds benefit the Stanford Parkinson's support group. So we'll talk about that at the end of the program as well. I also wanted to note that my book is a memoir. It's not a how-to book. It's not about how to be a caregiver. And that's in part because, as all of you who are caregivers know, every situation is so personal and so very different. And it's a different thing to care for a parent, obviously, than it is to care for a spouse, than it is to care for an adult, a child, or a sibling. And so my book is really a story. It's the story of my mom and me, and as Robin mentioned, the almost 10 years caregiving time that we had together. And I think a good story, a story at its best, does something really important, even though it's not a how-to book. What I think a good story can do is to tell a human story, and to tell it in a way that resonates with others, so that you can sort of sense and feel the truth of that story, hopefully in a way that resonates with you. And I hope at least that that's what my memoir, Winter Stars, can do. So I'd like to begin by reading for you the prologue to the book. As Robin mentioned, I was 59 years old when I moved back in with my mom. She was 95 at the time. And so I'll start by reading the prologue of the book, which will just take about 4.5 minutes to read. And it actually begins with a scene that happened 6 years into my caregiving time with my mom. So this is 6 years after I moved in. And at this point, my mom is really starting to slip cognitively. She'd always been incredibly able and bright and on top of things, but she'd really started to slip by this point. And this is a scene where that takes place at that moment in time. And while I knew that she was slipping, and others around us, including the caregivers I had during the day while I was at work, knew that, what I didn't realize until that morning, this morning that I'm now going to describe, is that my mom knew it too. So, winter stars, an elderly mother, an aging son, and life's final journey. Prologue. In the fall of 2013, I walked into the kitchen of my mom's house in Menlo Park, California. She was 101 years old, and the early stages of dementia were beginning to take hold. She looked up at me and said, "David, I think there are two Adelaides. There's the good Adelaide, the one who's pretty and smart and knows how to do things. And there's the bad Adelaide, the one who's ugly and stupid and can't do anything. I'm not sure which one is here right now," she said to me, "but I think it's the bad Adelaide." My mom had always been a force. She'd graduated from high school at age 16, from college at 20, and at the top of her class in both. She'd been a teacher, a devoted spouse, a mother of three, a passionate sports fan, a loyal friend, and a powerhouse volunteer. When she was 94, she'd thrown out the first pitch at a Stanford University baseball game. At 96, she made phone calls in her own distinctive style, urging people to vote for Barack Obama. And now the long arc of her remarkable life was turning in a new direction. Yet she'd been able to describe what was happening to her with searing precision and without tears. She was like that. She didn't blink, confronting most challenges with a firm, no-nonsense demeanor. No one ever trifled with Adelaide Iverson, and that included me. I'd moved in with my mom 6 years before. After my dad had died, she lived independently for 13 years. But at age 95, she'd had a difficult bout with pneumonia and couldn't manage fully on her own. I was a broadcaster and filmmaker living in nearby San Francisco at the time. My life was full but flexible, and it didn't take much deliberation to decide that it just made sense for me to move in and help. My mom and I had always been close. We shared interests and passions. But more than that, there'd always been a certain ease to our relationship. We understood each other. We were a comfortable pairing. And with that, at the age of 59, I moved back into my boyhood home. But there was a great deal I did not know. I didn't know I'd become so exhausted. I didn't know I'd be capable of getting so angry. I didn't know I'd be tested in ways I never imagined or rewarded in ways I'd never dreamed. I didn't know that someone with dementia can still be poetic, or that I'd get proficient at transferring my mom from bed to commode and back again, but never quite master the intimate skill of changing diapers. I didn't know I'd be joined and strengthened by remarkable women caregivers who became my teachers, my comrades, and my kin, or that I'd discover the Parkinson's disease that I had been diagnosed with a few years before would present fewer challenges than being a caregiver. I didn't anticipate that during that time, the two most meaningful professional experiences of my life would take place, or that I'd wind up getting married. And I never imagined that after I moved back in, my mom would live for another full decade before passing away at the age of 105. The 10-year caregiving odyssey we shared affected me, humbled me, and reoriented me more than any other experience in my life. And during that decade together, my mom and I drew closer, I'd like to think, both to each other and to our truest selves. This is the story of our journey and of the remarkable women caregivers who accompanied us and changed our lives. I wanted to talk a little bit first about that choice that I made at that point in my life when I was in the middle of a busy professional career, especially given the fact that just a few years before I'd been diagnosed with Parkinson's. And it wouldn't surprise me if a few of you were thinking at that time, like, well, what was he thinking? What was he thinking? After all, not only had he been diagnosed with Parkinson's, but his dad had Parkinson's as well, and his older brother. But as you can probably tell even today, I am incredibly lucky. As you all know, Parkinson's is an incredibly idiosyncratic disease. And I have been and continue to be incredibly lucky in my ability to manage the disease. And part of the reason why I chose to move in was because I think that even at that point, I felt something that probably most people with Parkinson's really feel, perhaps all of us, which is I still wanted to be useful. I still really wanted to not only be useful professionally, but to be important in my family and to try to do something that I thought I could. It gave me a kind of sense of purpose, and it allowed me to feel like I could still do something. I could still continue to do something. It made me feel good about myself, honestly, that I could do that. And I think that was part of it. But the other part of it is that my mom had given me my first lesson in what true caregiving really involves. I'd seen what she'd done for my dad, especially in the later stages of his Parkinson's. She was fantastic. And she showed me that really in the end, what caregiving requires is love. And I knew I couldn't do exactly what she had done for my dad, but I knew I could be there. To use a sports phrase, I knew we could be on the same team and cheer for the same team. But having said all that, I would also say that I was totally not ready for it. And there was a little bit of, hubris, a little bit of cockiness about that. I sort of thought, well, sure, I can do this. I can do this. And of course, I really had not a clue as to what I was in for. And one of the things I came to understand is that it's fascinating to me is how little we think about elder care. I was 59 at the time, not a young man, obviously, in my well into middle age, approaching being in my old age, as I am now. But I really didn't think about it very much. And if you compare that to how much thought we put into becoming a parent, it's almost humorous in a sense. When we're becoming a parent, as I first did, over 40 years ago, you're so excited about it. You read up at it. In my day, we didn't have the web to read up on things. These days, you browse an infinite number of websites, but you prepare, you talk excitedly about all of this. You read every book you can. You greet this with such anticipation. But when it comes to caring for a parent, most of us, at least I didn't think about that at all. We sort of, it crosses our mind and we move on to something else, like what I'm going to make for dinner. And while, of course, there are some similarities between caring for a young child and caring for someone in need later in life, it's so very different. And while it's true that no one's fully prepared to become a parent, I'm not sure anyone is truly prepared to care for a parent. And I think that's something that every prospective caregiver, and maybe even in the middle of caregiving, needs to come to terms with, what it fully means to care for, to in time feed and clean and clothe another human being, another adult human being. In this case, my mom. So I'd like to talk a little bit more to some of those challenges that we face, because we all face great challenges in caregiving, I think, no matter how much we love the person we're caring for. And I should note that I was incredibly fortunate because I had help. Not every family caregiver does. Probably many of you watching today don't have much help, if any. I did. I had wonderful women caregivers who came in during the day so that I could continue to work. And then I came home and was with my mom at night and on the weekend. And in time, I got more help still. I had it so much better than many do, than most do, I suspect. But I succumbed to exhaustion. I succumbed to getting irritated and cranky. I succumbed to being angry more often than I would like to admit. So I'd next like to read another excerpt from my book that talks about some of that part of caregiving, about sleep deprivation and where that leaves you, and about anger. So this is from chapter 10 in my book. It was often around 1 o'clock in the morning and the bell would ring. My mom was heading for the bathroom, and that meant I was heading there too. My bedroom was just 10 feet from my mom's, and when she headed for the bathroom, I would usually hear the thump of her walker leaving the bedroom carpet and landing on the hallway's hardwood floor. But on occasion, I'd miss that telltale thud. And since it wasn't safe for her to go to the bathroom on her own, my nephew and I installed a hallway bell with a button by her bedside that she could ring when she got up at night. And if it rang before 2 a.m., then I knew I was likely in for what I came to call a 3-bell night. We all know that sleep is a precious commodity, but caregiving requires you to experience the biology of that truth in a brand new way. Of all of the challenges one confronts in caregiving, for me, none was more unforgiving than lack of sleep and its consequences. But acknowledging sleep's importance isn't the same as devising a specific plan to achieve better sleep, especially if you're short on the clarity and focus you need to create such a plan. Even something as seemingly straightforward as getting a single night off suddenly seems daunting. After all, I found myself saying, I'm surviving. Shouldn't I stick it out as long as I can? But here's a caregiving truth I believe in. All family caregivers need more help than they think they do. And all caregivers come to that realization later than they should. You tell yourself you can manage. We all think we can manage. And one night, 2 years after I'd moved in, everything came unglued, including me. My mom's house had always been the location for larger family gatherings, but in recent years, my dad's youngest sister, Alice, had taken over those duties. And on this particular night, Alice was having my mom and me and the rest of the family over for dinner. And from the moment my mom's walker hit Alice's living room floor with an aggravated thump, I had the sense that we were all in for it. She wasn't happy, snapping at my sister-in-law, Yoko, when she offered her an appetizer, complaining about where she was sitting, and responding crossly when one of us tried to respond to her grievances. Over the next hour, I finally found myself getting more and more irritated. Finally, I stepped over to her and said exactly as I would to a 4-year-old, if you can't act better, we're going home. A few minutes later, we headed for the dinner table. I didn't know you could stalk across the floor while using a walker, but my mom did. My Aunt Alice asked her again where she wanted to sit, and my mom snapped at her again. That did it. That's it, I said to her, we're going home. I steered her out of the room, out the doorway, and into the car, and we drove home in silence. When we arrived at the house, I ushered her into her bedroom with hands as comforting as steel. She stood next to her bed for a moment, gripping her walker, and then she collapsed onto the bedspread. "I hate myself," she wailed. And here's the thing. I didn't say a word. I didn't feel anything other than a cold sense of satisfaction. I was acting like a self-righteous parent who'd appropriately reprimanded a bratty but now repentant child. But as I look back, I don't think I fully took in what my mom was saying. I think when she said she hated herself, she meant exactly that. She hated who she was becoming, hated the sense that she was increasingly trapped in a world where she could no longer be who she had always been, including the person who'd always hosted family occasions. My mom's wail was from the heart, but sometimes I felt like my own heart had turned cold. I want to repeat one phrase that I read in that passage. And I'd be curious to know if those of you watching agree with this. All caregivers need more help than they think they do. And all caregivers realize that later than we should. Again, I was lucky. I had the resources to pay for help during the day. And so I realized my circumstance was better than many. And yet, I don't think I've ever been as exhausted and angry as I was during many of those days that I was a caregiver. But I would also say that because of that same experience, the caregiving brings you face to face with your own vulnerabilities, with your own weaknesses, with your very human flaws. One of mine, for example, was always wanting to be right. I like being right. I like letting other people know I was right, including my mom. I'll talk a little bit more about that later when we talk a little bit more about dementia. But this is one of caregiving's silver linings, at least it was for me. It brought me face to face with some of my weaknesses, some of my less attractive qualities, like wanting to be right. And that way I came to think of caregiving as being a bit like a heat-seeking missile that, it seeks out your vulnerabilities and it pierces those weaknesses. In fact, I came to think that if you'd like to change certain parts of your personality, then I don't know if there are many better self-improvement courses than caregiving. I'd like to turn next, and then we'll be taking questions in 10 or 15 minutes, but I'd like to go through a couple of more topics first, if I may. And this is about how hard caregiving is, which is, again, something I did not appreciate. But what the caregiving experience also taught me is how we don't honor enough the people who do this work for a living, who are professional, like the women who joined me, who were extraordinary. They were all immigrant Americans, all women of color. Two of them, Eileen Khan and Sanai Latu, were with me for almost the entirety of my time as a caregiver. They taught me so much. And we just don't honor them enough in this country. We so need to change that. We so need to change that. And it also helped me understand certain things about our society that I'd covered as a journalist, topics like immigration, but I understood them in a really different way after being under the same roof sometimes with immigrant Americans who had such extraordinary skill. So I'd like to read you another passage from my book now. It's quite short, but talks a little bit about these remarkable women. Caregiving deepened my perspective on stories I sometimes covered on the radio or on television, like immigration. Until I became a caregiver, I hadn't had good friends who'd had to work 2 jobs or sleep on the floor in order to make ends meet. I hadn't seen the skill and compassion it takes to attend to someone else's most basic needs and to do so with tenderness and ease. And I hadn't understood, at least not in such an intimate way, the additional challenges you sometimes face if your last name is Taufa or Morales or Khan or Latu, when your skin is brown and English is your second or third language. Their lives told me a very different story than the talk shows I sometimes moderated on immigration, where we discussed topics like whether all immigrants should possess specialized technological skills before being allowed into this country. In a nation where there will soon be nearly 80 million people over the age of 65, who do we think is going to provide care for those in need? And what kind of skill will that take? And how should those skills be valued? Eileen and Sinai, along with Mele and Ronette and others, enhanced my life every bit as much as they did my mom's. It surprised me how enriching and important those relationships became. And when unexpected kindness enters your life at a time when you need it most, it washes over your very being, releasing a wave of gratitude that can carry you through the great swirls of uncertainty that will so often surround you. You begin to realize that you are not entirely alone, not when someone offers the simple but extraordinary act of just being there when it's needed most. My mom and I were living under the same roof once more, but it was really Sinai and Eileen who turned that old house back into a home. You know, we still don't have a national plan for elder care in this country. All of you know that very well. And again, I was incredibly lucky. My folks had purchased a home in Menlo Park, California in 1950, for $15,000. That's $15,000. And by the time I moved in with my mom in 2007, it was worth just a little bit more than that. It was a golden nest egg we could draw upon to afford and pay for my mom's care and pay those women the wage they deserved. But what kind of a national plan is that, you know? That it takes buying a house in Menlo Park in 1950 to be able to afford adequate care. This is something we really must change. We really must change. And it's my great hope that we will see those changes and see them soon. I want to touch on one more area, and then we will, Robin and Denise and I will take your questions. And please, put those in the chat room or the chat space, or use the hand raising function when we get to those in just a moment. I want to talk now about the question of dementia. When my mom was confused or would repeat herself endlessly or couldn't remember what she'd done, too often I'd correct her. I'd get frustrated, as I've already talked about. or I just wouldn't believe her. I just wouldn't accept her version of events. I wouldn't accept her reality. And I want to tell you a brief story before I read this excerpt that sort of illustrates that. It was a moment that happened when I walked back into work from home, came back home from work one day, and I walked in to the kitchen where my mom was sitting. She was reading the newspaper. At that point, she still could. And she put it down and she looked up at me and said, "David, you won't believe what happened to me today." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, I was left in the bathroom by myself for hours and hours." And I said, "You were left alone in the bathroom for hours?" And she said, "Yes, hours and hours." And I knew that couldn't be factually true, but I didn't really know what to say other than to say, "Well, I'm sorry that you had that experience. I'll talk to Mele, our caregiver, and see if I can understand what happened." And with that, she, picked up her paper and started reading again. And I didn't know what to do other than to ask Mele what had happened. And I just said, "Well, Mele, what, my mom thinks she was left alone for a long time, or it felt to her like it was a long time. What happened?" And she said, she just had a big grin on her face. She said, "David, I walked her into the bathroom, helped her sit down on the toilet. And I left the room for a minute or two. And when I came back in, she'd fallen asleep. She was just sitting there dozing. So I let her sleep for another, 5 minutes, 10 minutes or so. And then I came back in and woke her gently, and we went on with her day." I never told my mom what had happened. And she let it go. I don't think she remembered what had happened either. But after a while, I kind of began to understand that maybe what had happened is that something that probably has happened to all of us, that she'd been sitting there, as sometimes happens when you're reading a book, and she just dozed off. And then she woke up with a start, and it felt to her like she'd been asleep for a really long time, even though it'd just been a few minutes. I've had that experience. And so from our point of view, that it didn't happen. She wasn't asleep for hours and hours. That wasn't factually right. But that's our reality. Her reality was that she'd been asleep for a really long time. We always say in journalism, you're not entitled to your own facts. You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And unfortunately, we now live in a political time where that doesn't seem to be the case. But I think it's also legitimately not the case when someone has dementia. I think those were my mom's facts. That was her reality. And it took me a long time to kind of begin to accept that, and to accept who she was, that I needed to be present to the person who was right in front of me, not the person I wanted her to be, not the person she once was, not even the person she was yesterday, but just be present to that person. And part of what helped me do that was to begin to have more moments where she would say things that were actually incredibly insightful, even though they were really novel expressions. One time I was showing her pictures of her great-grandchildren on my laptop, and the screen went dark, and it just stayed dark. And she looked at it and looked at it and looked at it at this dark screen. And then she looked up at me and said, "It's like looking into a dark river and not being able to see the fish." Well, what's that about? I'd be really interested if any of you have had similar experiences that are so perceptive and unusual. One day she said to me, "I feel like the sun surrounded by clouds. The sun understands me. It's trying to poke through the gray." Well, that must be exactly what it feels like when you're confused and yet you want to be clear. And so after many years and after a great deal of time, I tried to get better at that. And so I want to read you a scene now about the last time I took my mom to the beach. Where I really tried to be present to who she was and where she was. My mom had always loved the ocean. We'd taken the same drive as a family for over 60 years, over La Honda Road and heading towards Highway 1. When I was a kid, we'd always compete to see who could spot the ocean first. And today, as we approached the old San Gregorio General Store, the ocean came into view a mile or so away. My mom wasn't able to see it, so I said, I have to keep my eyes on the road, Mom, so just let me know when you see the ocean. About 100 feet from the water, she exclaimed, I see it, and a wide smile creased her face. We were at the point where I wanted us both to savor these moments, precisely because I knew they wouldn't last. The moments can't be banked or reclaimed later when you need a good moment credit. I knew I'd remember this trip and that she might not. In fact, I knew that later that day, she might complain that she'd never been to the ocean, hadn't been to the ocean for a long time. When similar exchanges had taken place in the past, I'd often reminded her, sometimes pleadingly, of whatever it was that we'd just done. I no doubt sounded like a kid trying to convince a parent she was wrong, probably because I was a kid trying to convince a parent she was wrong. But as we drove along the water on this beautiful spring day, I just tried to remember to do better, to just be in the scene I was in, to take in the joy I saw on her face, precisely because it would only be experienced then. For her, there wouldn't be a later savoring. I tried to remember that moments are to be treasured because they do not last. Like a cloud pushed by the wind, moments part as they become. As always, we pulled to a stop at Pescadero State Beach, our ocean destination for the past 60 years. Nobody in my family knows why this is true. Bean Hollow, a few miles further south, is prettier. Pomponio, a few miles to the north, affords longer walks along the cliffs. But Pescadero is home. As we parked there, I happened to notice that the children's book, The Little Engine That Could, was on the back seat. I'd recently purchased one of those classic editions to take back east to read to my then 3-year-old granddaughter. I didn't know why, but I asked my mom if she wanted me to read it to her, and she said yes. Maybe she liked the title because, just like the little engine, she was someone who also always thought she could and was deeply annoyed when she could not, when events transpired to obstruct her daily mission, which was to get up in the morning and do what needs to be done for the good of the family and the good of society, and you do not stop. For my mom, getting old didn't include giving herself a pass. Accepting limitations was not within her DNA. It was her greatest strength, and now sometimes the source of her greatest sorrow. But in that moment, I read to her a story, and together we took in the sound of the words, the wind, and the waves. Me. It's pretty out here today, isn't it? Adelaide. I like what's covering me. Me. Do you mean the blanket? Adelaide. I mean the sky. So why don't we stop there, Robin and Denise, and see if there are questions that people would like to pose. I'd like to read one more excerpt before we close, just to wrap things up. It's a short Christmas about the last Christmas I spent with my mom, a short excerpt about the last Christmas I spent with my mom. But why don't we stop now and see if there are some questions that I can respond to.
Okay, sounds wonderful. Yes, we have received some questions, Dave. Thank you for the wonderful presentation thus far. And I've been fortunate enough to actually read the book, and so I have some questions about things that I read in the book. And one thing you've made clear in your talk today was how fortunate you were that your parents had bought this gold mine of a home back in the 1950s and for only $15,000. And that was really a nest egg for you guys, which was wonderful. One other thing that struck me from the book that it seemed you were fortunate on is that your mother, Adelaide, was very willing to accept support and assistance. She took it as just a very natural thing. Well, why wouldn't she have somebody come in and help her? Why wouldn't she have someone come in and cook? Why wouldn't she use a walker? Well, of course she would. And could you talk a little bit about whether she ever objected to having any of this kind of assistance?
Yeah. No, thank you, Robin, for bringing that up. It surprised me, to tell you the truth. She was a fiercely independent woman, had great pride, and was a woman of great accomplishment. In a different age, she would have been a powerhouse attorney or a congresswoman, who knows? But it surprised me. And I think it's also because for her, she was incredibly practical. What mattered to her was the end, not the means. What mattered to her was continue leading the life that she wanted to live. And if that meant having some extra help, so be it. If that meant using a walker, why not? If that meant having her son move in with her, well, of course, I think that those were a means to an end. Not that she didn't appreciate them. She did when she was still able to express that. She did. And there were plenty of times when she objected to me and objected to our caregivers and didn't want to take a pill or, she was fearsome. Sometimes she had a stare like nobody's business. I mean, sometimes I would try to outstare her and it never worked out very well. So I don't want to act like she was just, always accepting. She wasn't, but she was incredibly pragmatic. I mentioned her throwing out the first pitch at a Stanford baseball game. She was a maniacal Stanford fan. She and my dad had season tickets to football and basketball, and they went forever. And after my dad died, she kept going, at least to baseball and basketball games. She loved it. And so and so I used to joke that my greatest service was driving her to Stanford games. That's what mattered to her, was doing what she wanted to be able to do. When she quit driving, she just budgeted a certain amount of money to take cabs before I moved in with her, the period from 90 to 95 after she quit driving. She wanted to quit while she was ahead. She spent money on cabs to go see her friends, go, she'd take the train to the city. I mean, she was a remarkable person, and not lacking in self-confidence. And never had a low opinion of her ability. And I think in an odd, almost counterintuitive way, that allowed her to accept help because she was Adelaide Iverson and that's what she was going to do.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. You say in the book that caregiving doesn't offer decision points at convenient intervals. Could you give an example of that?
Yeah, I think, one thing I learned was that I'm a planner and I like to organize things. And I would come up with these carefully thought out plans for how things were going to work and who was going to cover this when I was going to go away on an overnight for work or whatever. I was going to go see Lynn, my significant other, a woman who lived in Berkeley. I have all these plans to take care of things. And then they would all fall apart. And I quickly learned that, you can have whatever you want on your plan and on your to-do list, but it all falls apart if your caregiver gets sick or something else happens. There's nothing convenient. There's nothing said about it. Plans last until they don't, that's it, and things come undone at the least convenient times, often. And so I'm not great at I used to say that being a caregiver is a bit like being a jazz musician. You have to be able to improvise. You have to sort of be able to, it's like call and response. Someone says something and you respond to that, and then you adjust, and then you adjust again, and then you adjust again. And that never stops. And that was really hard for me. It was really hard for me to think that I have got to, doesn't matter if I came up with this beautiful plan yesterday, it doesn't work. So get over it and get on to what's next. That was the big one of many lessons for me.
A lot of people are having the same question, Dave, which is that, as we all know, one of the challenges when you have Parkinson's disease is that, in general, stress is not good for the situation. It's not good for your symptoms.
Yeah.
Did Parkinson's disease affect your caregiving at all?
I think it would now, more than it did then. I'm now 73 years old, and my symptoms are still, wonderfully under control, especially physically. I fall occasionally. I would be less stable at 2 a.m. helping someone in the bathroom than I was at that time. I don't deal with stress as well now. I have many more problems with anxiety, for example, in particular, which is very common, as we all know, in Parkinson's. But at that point, it really didn't. And again, I attribute this in part to having help. I really could, and I got more breaks as I went on. I used to be there every night and every weekend, and then over time, I would take a night off. And then I would take 2 nights off. And then gradually, after 8 years, I realized I just couldn't do it as full-time anymore. And so I was just there 2 nights a week, the last 2 years of my mom's life, 2 nights and 2 days a week. So I was, again, I'm extremely fortunate. One other quick point about that is I also was maniacal about exercise. And I took up long distance running when I was a caregiver. And that was an escape in part. I'd go out for a run. And again, I could because I had someone else there. And it gave me a lot of strength and like, I can do this. I'm an old guy and yet I can still run. And during the time I was a caregiver, I was able to run in 4 New York City marathons to raise money for the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And that gave me enormous satisfaction, and I think helped my Parkinson's enormously too. And Robin, and for everyone listening, I think we will all learn in time, and we're already learning in time, that Parkinson's isn't one disease. It's many, many diseases, and it exists along a continuum. And I got really lucky. I'm at this end of the continuum. Yeah. And I don't want to pretend otherwise. I think I've done a good job of doing my best to manage it, especially in terms of exercise. But I'm also just really, really, really fortunate.
Yeah. Several people are curious about the caregiving angels that you had, these women of color, immigrant women. Yeah. That you hired. How did you find them? Did they all start full time? Did you gradually ramp up? That sort of question.
Yeah. Started out with one person who worked 35 hours a week during the day from an agency that a friend of mine had recommended. You learn quickly that you need friends who've gone through this and people you can talk with. And a friend of mine recommended a particular agency, and we interviewed that person before my mom left the hospital after that bout with pneumonia that I described. And we both liked the same person, fortunately. And so she was the first person. And then after that, and she left us after a few years, talk about inconvenient timing. She actually had a life of her own. She actually decided to have another child. And so, as we all know, it's, trying to find out the next person. And again, I got a recommendation from someone, another friend, who's recommended someone who she'd had care for her father. And I hired this person independently, another immigrant American who was fantastic until she decided also about some things about starting a family. So you go through that. But I was really lucky then to have these two women who I both hired independently. One who was a caregiver, who was a worker at a nursing home where my mom was after a second hospitalization. And I knew the moment she walked into that room that she could manage my mom, who was not, you needed a certain kind of chutzpah about you to contend with my mom. And Eileen had that. And so I asked her if she wanted an extra job working part-time, and she did. And then she later became more than full-time with us. And similarly, another woman was someone who had taken care of a good friend of my mom's on the Stanford campus. My mom used to go read to her friends who could no longer read until she was into her 90s. And this was someone who had cared for one of her friends. And when I called this woman after this friend of my mom's died, she said, Adelaide was one of the most faithful visitors to Sally, and she helped me a lot. And if Adelaide's the one who needs help now, then I want to help too. So my mom actually was responsible for providing this wondrous caregiver in a sense. So again, there's a lot of good fortune of that. And we became really, really close. Sinai and Eileen and I were still in close contact today. They mean the world to me. And I will always be grateful for them.
As a practical matter, how did you handle payment of their income taxes and W-2s and all that kind of thing?
Well, with the agency people that we had, of course, that's taken care of. For the private hires, I developed different systems. I would pay them. I wanted to be able to deduct it, from my mom's taxes. And so I kept track of all of that. And I told them that. And in the case of one person, I came up with an arrangement. She said, yes, I agree. And I want to pay my own taxes, but will you just kind of withhold the money for me? And so I did. And so that on a quarterly basis, I would take all of that and say, okay, here it is, pay your taxes. But, there's a little bit of trust and, that you go through with that. And, sometimes you turn a blind eye on something. And I rationalized my way through a few of those dilemmas because I believed in them and I believed in what we were all trying to do. But that was basically how I approached it.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I thought was interesting is that everybody, I think, on this call is participating or has participated in a caregiver support group. You yourself never participated in a formal caregiver support group, but it seems that you got support for yourself in different ways. Could you speak to that?
Great question, Robin. Thank you. I didn't, but I had built-in caregiving support in that Eileen and Sinai and I would talk all the time, and we would stay up at night talking. I got to know them. I got to know their stories, and they got to know mine. And they knew that, and, just as I appreciated and valued them, they knew I cared about them and that Adelaide did too. And they knew that even when I'd fail and fall flat on my face, that I was trying and I was doing the best I could, and they appreciated that. So they were that. My brothers were too. Neither of them were able to participate in providing day-to-day caregiving support. One because he lived far away, another for health reasons, both for health reasons. But they were supportive. They really appreciated what I was doing, and they told me that. And that meant a lot to me. It's easy to get resentful when things aren't even. And there were times when I did feel resentful. I'll be honest about that. But I knew in the end I was doing something that I wanted to do. No one forced me to do this. I wanted to do it. And I was doing something they couldn't. And they appreciated that. And that meant a lot to me. My sisters-in-law were both spectacularly supportive. And I will also say there's in this unique situation, or at least in my situation, there's some value when if it's caring for a parent. I wouldn't have wanted to manage the sibling part of all of this. And I kind of liked the fact that it was up to me. And that's a weakness of mine to some extent, that I like being in charge and making the decisions. That can cut both ways, and it's sometimes not a great quality at all. But in some ways it suited me to have it be more on me. And lastly, and by no means least, I had extraordinary support from my then partner, now wife, Lynn, who understood, and was sympathetic. She didn't love it always, and we had things we had to work through, but she was remarkably supportive and loving. And for that, I will also be always grateful.
You've said in your book, there were so many things that resonated with me, but one thing in particular I wrote down, "We got by," which I would learn counts as an A rating in caregiving. So, just sort of muddling through sometimes is the best you can do.
Yeah. It's not about perfectionism, and I'm a perfectionist. And you have to let go of that, and accept your failings, and accept your rewards, that there is something extraordinary about being with someone you love in this most intimate way, because caregiving is an intimate act. And I think that, you learn all over again that love isn't about what you say, it's about what you do. And that most acts of love are in the end physical acts, and caregiving is physical. It's very physical. And I'll always be grateful. I had that experience, and for what it taught me. And it brought me that much closer to someone who had always been important to me. And we weathered some tough times together that brought us that much closer.
You said in I think it's in the press release about the book, that you said that though it was an arduous, almost 10-year journey, and fraught with challenges and in a sense the demolition of those traits that you held on so deeply about yourself, being Mr. Right and taking.
Well, I still have those,
Yeah.
Robin. They're far from demolished. I would say I've become a marginally better person.
That despite all of that, you would still do it again.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you would do it differently.
Oh, for sure. Oh, totally. I mean, that's one reason why I have a few misgivings about all the how-to caregiving books. I just don't think there's a template. And I think to say this is how you do it is a fool's errand. There's no one way to do this. Absolutely, I would do things differently. But then I discovered that those were mistakes too. I mean, I just think that's how it is. And when I say I would do it again, it's another way of saying that I don't regret doing it, that I'm really glad I did that. I used to tease my now wife, Lynn, by saying, don't ever think that I'm doing this again. If you don't ever think that. And as you'll,
does she say to you, don't think that I'm doing this for you?
But I think we both we both would and have, each in our own way. And as you'll learn at the end of the book, there is something that happens with Lynn, although she's doing great today. Yeah.
Yeah. As I said, so much resonated about your book with me, but one other thing I wrote down was, you said, the question I probably asked the most during my time as a caregiver was, now what? Whenever I thought I'd figured things out, I hadn't. My solutions usually worked until they didn't. And you find that no matter what you've learned, it does not predict what lies ahead. I think this is so true for caregivers, that we figure things out for a moment, and then the circumstances change, and you're on to a new crisis or new decisions or new task.
Yeah, and what seems really, really hard, 6 months later, you look back on that moment that you thought was really hard, and you think, well, those are the good old days, and there's a trajectory, that you're on, and you just have to keep adjusting and adapting, I think. And my mom, made it easier in a way, because she was such a force and such a presence, and she was capable of so much good and did so much good in her life. And she would call. I remember one day I was in the other room, and she said to Eileen, our caregiver, she said, David thinks he's always right, and he's not, but we'll just let him think that way.
Well, and conversely, you were having the same thought as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as my friend David Leventhal, who many of you know of probably as the head of the Dance for PD program out of the Mark Morris Dance Group, he said to me, I began by reading the prologue about the two Adelaides, the good Adelaide and the bad Adelaide. And David said to me that after reading the book, he said, I think there are two Daves. There's the good Dave and the bad Dave. And that's true. It's true for all of us.
Yeah, indeed. One approach for a lot of families that we often recommend in our caregiver support groups is having the person with a neurological diagnosis, or any elderly person, in fact, go to an adult daycare center. And there's a terrific one in Menlo Park called Rosner House. Did you ever consider that for your mom, or was that just not the Adelaide Iverson style?
Really wasn't her style. The idea of being in an assisted living living arrangement was, I could never quite imagine. I really thought about it at one point when we were running out of money, when we were running out of our home equity loan. And I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do? And one of my thoughts was, I've got to move her somewhere, and then I can rent the house, and then that'll give us income. Fortunately, we came up with another solution. But she was not really, and I didn't think, set up for living full-time in an assisted living facility. And even I thought, we were lucky. She had some very faithful friends who continued to come by and were with her. She would always refer to them as her younger friends, which meant people in their early 80s or late 70s or mid 70s, my age now. And they were great. So she had a lot of, and we went to a whole lot of basketball games and baseball games. So we were able to provide ways of socialization. And because I had those wonderful caregivers during the day, I had breaks and respite. So from a respite standpoint, it wasn't, I didn't at least need that.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And in fact, I met your mom several times, and you were always out and about with her, and take her places, and she loved going. She seemed to relish the attention as, I'm Dave Iverson's mother. And she knew her stuff anyway.
I don't think she yeah, she didn't consider me any great shakes. I mean, it wasn't, but yeah, she loved being out and about. She would always wanted to be part of the action. It's part of why she loved live sports. You know, it was here, it was now, it was fast, it was happening. She loved that, always loved that. And that was very much, in fact, you know, even late in life when she was bedridden, the last year and a half or so of her life, she would kick at the railings of her hospital bed, you know, because she wanted to be moving, and she would say, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? You know, she wanted to be in motion always.
Yeah. One other trait of your mother's, and perhaps a trait that you adopted as well, that comes across in the book, is her sense of denial. That it was again, back to her pragmatism. It was her utilitarian way of getting through life, was just kind of, in a sense, denying inconveniences that were around her. Did that help you to get by, to cope with the situation, because she was in somewhat of denial?
Well, it's a funny thing because it sounds contradictory that she was practical and yet had some degree of denial. I think in her, they were side by side. She was very practical and, as I say, accepted help in order to do what she wanted to do. But she certainly didn't, think of herself as being necessarily compromised until that time, especially when dementia was beginning to take hold and she was aware that something was amiss. And I think throughout her life, she approached things with that sort of like, well, I can still do things. And she would, she would talk about conversations she had with my dad about politics, when I knew my dad really wasn't capable of having that conversation. But it was important, I think, to her to maintain that. And I think for her, it was out of respect to who my dad still was. And I believe in their own way, they did have conversations. And I think, there were some little fictions about her. She would say, when she was in her 80s, I'm going out for my daily 2-mile walk. Well, it's really like about a little less than a mile. But so what, and I think a little bit of denial, a little bit of rationalization can go a long ways. And I was certainly prone to that, and I think some of that allows you to do what needs to be done. Because if you really look at how hard this is, it sometimes keeps you from doing what needs to be done. So I think sometimes a little bit of denial can be a useful tool.
Yeah, completely. Long ago, when you had opportunity to speak to our Palo Alto Parkinson support group meetings when they were at Avenidas, you employed the concept of addition, not subtraction. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could apply that same concept to caregiving now that you've had long-term experience as a caregiver.
Yeah, what Robin's referring to is I came to think of Parkinson's disease as a disease of subtraction, that it takes things from you, one by one, whether that's an arm that doesn't swing, or your your stride that isn't what it once was, or your ability to smile, sometimes your voice. And that the only way you can compensate with a disease of subtraction is to keep adding things into your life. And my mom was, exhibit A for someone who kept adding things into her life. And I think that's true. I think if you are a caregiver, it's too easy sometimes to make excuses to not do things. Oh, I don't have time for that, or I can't do that, or it's too much of a bother to arrange to go have lunch with a friend. We all do that, and it's totally understandable because it's a pain in the neck to make arrangements so that you can't go out to lunch. But I think doing those things, adding those things, for me, it was having some nights with Lynn, or being able to go for a run, to add that back into your life is pretty crucial, because otherwise it can, it can just, suck you dry. I remember once going to church with my mom at Mem Chu on the Stanford campus to the Stanford Catholic Community Service, and the priest giving the homily and saying, you can't write a check if your checkbook's empty. And I remember hearing that and thinking, well, yeah, right. You got to make sure you replenish what you have.
Okay, there's one more question, Dave, and I'm going to leave it up to you if you'd like to have this question before or after the final excerpt that I know you wanted to read, because it's somewhat applicable. The question is, did you go through depression or loss after the intense caregiving you experienced with your mom? And how long did that last, if you experienced it, and how did you get through that period?
Yeah. When I finally made the decision that I could only be there 2 nights a week and 2 days a week, I worked out this sort of intricate schedule that allowed me to be there part of Monday, and then I would stay Monday night, and then part of most of Tuesday. Then I would go back to Lynn's, and then come back down on Thursday and be there part of Thursday, and then most of Friday. So I felt like I was there, but I was really a son at that point, not her caregiver. I was the one coordinating care and being there a lot, but not in charge. I felt relief, honestly, about coming to that place. But towards the very end of her life, it was, what was hard for me was when my mom was on hospice for 2 years. She went on hospice when she was 103. She lived to be 105. And there comes a time where you think, oh my goodness gracious, how long will this go? And then you feel like, oh, yeah, is that how I feel? And I would say to myself, yeah, that's how you feel. And I had to kind of accept that. And that took some work. But when my mom died, I was surprised. I woke up the next morning and just burst into tears. I just burst into tears. She died the afternoon before, and I'd spent the night at the house, out in my dad's old study. And Eileen and Sinai had stayed next to my mom until, my mom had been taken to the mortuary that evening, and then they stayed in those bedrooms in the house. And I just sobbed out in my dad's study, and I walked in, and I had this feeling like this focal point of my life, this person who has been sort of my compass in a lot of ways, was no longer there. And it felt very strange. I couldn't quite believe it. And I walked in, and I saw Eileen and Sinai, and we all just stood there and in a 3-person hug for quite a long time. And and so there was sadness, but as there is so often, sorrow is so often connected to joy, to being close to the heart of what life is. Its sadness and its losses, but also in its beauty. And so I didn't struggle with depression afterwards. I felt privileged and grateful.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Thank you, Dave. Would you like to read that final excerpt then?
I would. Thank you, Robin. My mom was someone who was always restless. As I was saying a moment ago, she was someone who always wanted to be on the go and was always I used to want her to just kind of be at peace and go kind of gently. But that wasn't my mom. She was not going to go gently. But on this particular night, it's our last Christmas together, though she would live for many, many months after this. Something different. I saw something different. And this is about that time. When I walked into my mom's bedroom, I knew right away on this December night that she was in a different place. There wasn't any restlessness. She was quiet and calm, and she looked to be remarkably at peace. We just sat there for a long time, holding hands, and I felt a wave of tenderness come over me. After a while, my mom looked up at me and she said in a voice that was soft, but only slightly slurred, "You look wonderful." And I told her that she did too. "We make a good pair," I said. And she smiled and said, "What a pair." We just sat for a while, my hand on top of hers, just sitting together, nothing more. And then she turned to me and said, "I feel lucky." She said it with more clarity than anything I'd heard her say in recent months. And I told her that I felt lucky too, lucky for all that she had added to my life and to the lives of those around her, and that I would always remember what she taught me. And then she said it again, "I feel lucky." And so I asked her if she could tell me why. And there was a long pause. And then she looked at me with eyes as bright as winter stars and said, "Because there's love all around." There'd been plenty of times in recent years when I hadn't felt that love was all around, or even felt that love was around at all. But in that moment, I knew that she was right, that even in difficult times, perhaps especially in difficult times, unexpected love can still be found. You just have to be lucky enough to reach out and discover a welcoming embrace in return. My time as a caregiver had both drained me and filled me up, encompassing some of the hardest moments in my life and some of the most beautiful. I got both, and that made all the difference. And on that Christmas night, I felt something I hadn't experienced before, that while my time with my mom was still unfinished, our journey was now complete. We had endured our bursts of anger and frustration, but over time, our deep and abiding connection had always held. We had found a steadying. And while the currents of time and age had taken us into territory we'd never imagined, we'd kept traveling. And that journey had carried us to our truest destination as mother and son. It had brought me to the bedside of someone I loved so that I could hear the deepest of all truths, that love is all around.
Thank you, Dave. It's really wonderful. And as one of the advanced reviewers of the book read, it's a love story. It's a love story between mother and son, and between mother and so many other people, and son and so many other people around the mother. It's a wonderful story. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us in the book today.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you.
We wanted to say that Dave's website, I think Denise is going to post the information. Oh, there it is. So Dave's book called Winter Stars, An Elderly Mother, An Aging Son, and Life's Final Journey will be published next month, March 22nd. And you can learn more from Dave's website, which is daveiversonauthor.com. and email me, Robin Riddle, at whatever email address you use to reach me, either my Stanford address or my Brain Support Network address, either one. And let me know if you'd like to buy a copy of Dave's book when it's made available. And Dave has generously offered to have proceeds go to our local caregiver support group. So I have to figure out how that'll all work. But just email me and we'll take advantage of that. And if you'd otherwise like to buy the book, just wait until March 22nd and you can do that directly as well. So thank you so much, Dave. Did you want to say anything else?
Yeah, if I could just add one more point, if I might, Robin, about that. All the royalties from the book are going to go to support a number of organizations, including Dance for Parkinson's. So that's where all the proceeds of the book will go. But I really wanted to be able to do something for individual Parkinson's groups. So while you can go on my website, you can order the book now. You won't get it until March 22nd, but you can order it now through your favorite local bookstore, Amazon, whatever. But if you want to have it benefit the Stanford support group, then just email Robin. And what I'll do is I'll get the books to her, and then the Stanford PD group can keep the proceeds, if that makes sense. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. It's been a really great experience for me. Thank you for being interested. Tell your friends and others if you want about the book. I would appreciate that. My thoughts are with all of you. I admire anyone who goes down this path, and it's been a great pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And we're getting a lot of compliments, and somebody says, thank you so much for sharing this inspiring experience, Dave. So thank you. And we will not necessarily repeat the same webinar. We'll have a different conversation, but we're planning to do this again at the end of March, and all of you will be invited to attend that as well. I think it's March 30th at the same time. In the afternoon. So in case you missed it or want to see it again, or in case family members missed it, we look forward to seeing you. Thank you again so much, Dave. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.